Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our OSCE security chat entitled The Framework for Arms Control in an Age of Emerging Technologies. My name is Alexander Grave, and I'm a researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, IFSH. And this event is co-organized by the OSCE and IFSH. In the next 90 minutes, we want, together with you, discuss the challenges that technological modernization presents to arms control in the OSCE area, and more specifically, the challenges that they pose to existing principles, treaties, and agreements that are already in place. We are very glad to have with us four renowned experts, including Andrei Zaborski, Anja Fink, Jürgen Altmann, and Maike Verbruggen, who will tell us more about their views concerning the role of both modern and emerging military technologies and the impact on the existing OSCE arms control framework. In particular, the OSCE framework document from 1996. I will introduce all four panelists in a few minutes. Before we start, let me point out to some features of Zoom. There's actually only one, because if you have any questions during or after the presentation of our panelists, I encourage you to send us your questions via the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will collect these questions and I will address them to our experts in our Q&A session in the last 30 minutes or so of our event. If possible, please also tell us to whom your question is addressed to. You will also have the opportunity to upvote questions that you find particularly interesting or of importance. And so this question will increasingly appear up front and at the top of the list so that we will know that there is interest in getting an answer on this particular question. Last but not least, I also want to remind you that this session is recorded. But now let us jump right into the substance of our webinar. And first of all, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome OSCE Secretary General Helge Maria Schmidt and the permanent representative of Spain to the OSCE, Ambassador Luis Cuesta. Both will address you and our panelists with opening remarks. Ms. Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Could you please unmute yourself? Sorry, you're still muted. Still muted. Yep, I think you're good now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, good. There's some technical issues because it looked like I was unmuted before, but fine. So it's my pleasure also to welcome you to this security chat. It's a virtual format, but it allows us to reach out to capitals and to a larger audience. This was developed during the pandemic, so one of the positive sides of it, and I'm sure it will hopefully the pandemic is over soon, but I hope this will of course outlast the pandemic. And the aim of these short and focused events is to provide new ideas to policymakers on achieving the OSCE's objectives. So the topic for this first security chat is highly relevant, because when we talk about arms control in the OSCE, we often refer back to what was agreed in the 90s, an area which, as you all know, produced various treaties and agreements between all participating states. And this dealt with limitations on conventional weapon systems, the exchange of military information on armed forces and their exercises, and the verification of such limitations and information with technical or human means of verification. And all these instruments were mentioned as a web of interlocking and mutually reinforcing arms control obligations and commitments in the framework for arms control, which was agreed 25 years ago during the Lisbon Ministerial Council. This framework was supposed to contribute to the further development of the OSCE area as an indivisible common security space by guiding negotiations on further arms control measures. Its negotiating principles were sufficiency, transparency through information exchange, verification, and limitations on force. However, in the years passed since then, it's difficult to claim that stability and security has developed in a positive way. Provocative actions, a risk-prone environment, low transparency on military activities, and a high degree of mistrust is what unfortunately determines the current security climate in Europe. Some parties have either suspended or outright left arms control treaties, and the adaptation of agreements which should build security and confidence is at a standstill. So the question is, have we done enough to truly engage on the agreed terms back in 1996, such as indivisibility of security, not strengthen the security at the expense of others, or to create conditions conducive to the development of further confidence and security building measures, or CBMS. Don't we need further transparency to support our intentions, not to do harm to our neighbors? And we are all neighbors in the confined space that is Europe. Furthermore, the framework was focused on classical conventional weapons systems with a kinetic effect like tanks, artilleries, and combat aircraft and helicopters, or on large numbers of combat troops able to seize and able to hold territory. But the world has moved on since then. Additional threats come from new technologies. Long-distance precision-guided munitions, hypersonic weapons, uninhabited arms vehicles or UAVs, drones in swarms, and enhanced command and control networks to control all that. The list is endless. And another future is near, where artificial intelligence appears on the battlefield, where intangible cyber weapons threaten critical infrastructures, putting civil societies directly at risk, well before the level of armed conflict has even been reached. The effects can be immediate, without any warning time, and highly escalatory in nature. Is there still a human in the loop? The OSCE still has a long way to go to be able to engage in these developments driven by technology, which is already out there. We need to find a way to deal with current threats, since we are all affected. We all face the same risks, and there are no winners or zero-sum games. We're all in this together. The instruments we signed up to many years ago need to encompass both old and new threats to our security. And this requires engagement at the highest level in our capitals. We can't afford to leave this for another day. The upward spiral of increasing military activity, including close to others' borders, and the current distrust among states joined together in the OSCE needs to be reversed as a matter of urgency. There are positive signs which could guide us in that road, such as the structured dialogue to try to reinvigorate discussions on arms control and confidence in security building measures, and address the issues of new technologies. However, additional incentives would be beneficial to bring creative ideas to the table. I hope that this security chat will add positive aspects to that debate. My wish is that states re-engage on the proven principles for negotiation in our external context, which should include aspects of modern technology. Because genuine transparency and confidence in the 21st century needs to encompass the full spectrum of today's threats. I'm pleased to welcome renowned researchers and experts who are here today to engage with us on these topics and facilitate the discussion. And I look forward to an open and constructive debate. I hope it will benefit discussion on similar topics in other OSCE formats, including in the structured dialogue. Thank you very much.
The Secretary General, thank you very much for your words. And with this, I will pass on to Ambassador Cuesta, who will also share with us some opening remarks. Ambassador Cuesta.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. Good afternoon, everybody. Dear Secretary General, dear Helga, thank you very much for inviting me to intervene in this security chat about the OSCE framework for arms control in an age of emerging technologies, co-organized with the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. It is a pleasure and an honor to participate in the discussion today, not only because of the relevance of the topic, but also because of the quality of the speakers that have been invited to the panel. I guess that the audience is looking forward to their interventions, as I am, so my remarks will be rather short. Let me say from the outset that I think that the issue of emerging technologies in the context of the OSCE framework for arms control is a very topical one. Emerging technologies pose and will continue to be a challenge to security as much as an opportunity to reinforce security, for example, in terms of improved capacities for verification and enhanced transparency through the exchange of information. Today, I will be intervening in my national capacity. The concept note that has been circulated for this security chat, however, mentions the structured dialogue that Spain is chairing this year as one of the positive signs in the effort to reverse negative developments. The structured dialogue is a participating states-driven process which requires a certain level of understanding between delegations on the topics that can be included in the agenda. And until now, there hasn't been enough agreement on the issue of new technologies. So it is for participating states to decide. However, I believe that the issue of emerging technologies and the challenges and opportunities that they pose to security could very well fit in the mandate of a dialogue aimed at fostering a greater understanding on current and future challenges and risks to security, like the one defined in the Hamburg Declaration, when delegations deem it appropriate. Meetings such as the one today are very useful for delegations to observe what a dialogue on these issues could look like once they consider that the conditions are right. As Ambassador of Spain to the OSCE, I would like to take the opportunity to make 3 remarks on the questions asked in the concept note, since a discussion on the topic is a strong priority for my country. First, regarding the relevance of the framework. The framework in its introduction states that the full implementation and further development of arms control agreements is essential for enhancing military and political stability within the OSCE area, which means that the negotiators of the framework knew that to remain relevant, this web of interlocking and mutually reinforcing arms control obligations and commitments contained in the document had to be constantly updated. Hence, I believe that the Lisbon framework in itself hasn't lost any of its relevance, but the arms control obligations and CSBNs that it refers to need to be not only fully implemented, but also further developed to put them in line with the new realities. This is a commitment that all OSCE participating states assumed when agreeing to the framework, and I don't see it as an either-or commitment. Full implementation and further development go hand in hand, because when an agreement isn't duly renewed and updated, it automatically loses relevance, making its full implementation more problematic and unlikely. Second, regarding how to kickstart a renewed discussion about the principles, I need to hold back on this question since I think that some of the speakers may have some good ideas in this regard. On my side, I will only mention that I trust that meetings like this security chat can be very useful to exchange views on the matter and to open the way for discussions among participating states whenever it's possible. Ultimately, it depends on the political will of participating states to engage on discussions on such topics. Political will can be fluid, and it can or should be open to consider objective elements and reasoned arguments. Each state should balance the risks and benefits of engaging on discussions on matters affecting their national security. In the case of Spain, we believe that the benefits outweigh the possible risks, and we consider the risk of inaction to be much higher than the risk of having an open and transparent discussion on emerging technologies in good faith. Third, regarding the gap between the OSCE community dealing with conventional arms control and CSBM acquis, and those predicting and assessing the impacts of emerging technologies. It is a critical question, which fits directly into the previous one. I perceive a gap, which is the logical consequence of the absence of an ongoing discussion on the matter among participating states within the OSCE. If the political will of participating states is open as it should, bridging this gap, as is being done in today's meeting, could be instrumental to fit into the risk-benefit analysis of delegations. Certainly, states have the knowledge and the capacity to understand the challenges and opportunities of emerging technologies by themselves or exchanging views with their close partners and allies. However, bridging the gap within the OSCE entails an important added value, that all delegations would be in a position to do so jointly with other countries that they don't perceive as allies in pursuit of a common objective, which is the full implementation and further development of arms control agreements and CSBMs, or to transform common language, to do all that is in our hands to protect our common security and that of our citizens through dialogue and prevention. In conclusion, I want to thank you again, dear Secretary General, dear Helga, for introducing this topic in your security chat, and I trust that the audience will find it useful. I am sure that we will collect some interesting views and proposals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fuesta, for your words. And I believe that both the remarks of you and Secretary General Schmidt already point us into the right direction, namely that we want to use our event today to discuss and present creative new ideas on questions. What exactly are the challenges of these new technologies and how can we address them within the framework of the OSCE? And with that, let us turn to our four panelists who will share their views on these questions. We first have Professor Andrzej Zagorski, who has been studying the OSCE for decades, but is also a world-renowned specialist in arms control and Arctic security. Professor Zagorski is head of the department at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMMO, at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and professor at the Department of International Relations History of the MGIMO University in Moscow. He's also a member of the Russian International Affairs Council. In any case, we are very glad to have you here today. And I would like to start our discussion by looking back at the historical origins of the OSCE arms control framework in order to understand where we are coming from and what are the challenges today. Because when we look back at 1996, 25 years ago, at the time the framework document for arms control was established at the Lisbon summit of the OSCE, my question would be to you, what would you say is still the essence of the framework document today? Could you tell us a little bit more about the political circumstances at the time that led to its creation? What has changed? And how does the situation today differ from the situation back then? In other words, is the document and its principles, most importantly, still relevant?
Thank you very much, Alexander. Secretary General, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by going to the history, just for us to look at the circumstances at which the framework for arms control was designed and negotiated. This was an excellent time for arms control. 1996 was the time for the implementation of the CFE treaty, a very successful treaty, extremely successful treaty, at least in the 1990s and at the beginning of this century. Here I have a quotation from President Putin speaking in 2000. The CFE treaty has facilitated the epochal transformation of the military political landscape of Europe, avoiding any shocks. And that was a very important contribution. 1995 was the General Framework Agreement, the Dayton Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which also anticipated a series of sub-regional and regional arms control arrangements. which at least in the 1990s and thereafter have been considered as a very successful tool for addressing the questions and settling the regional conflict. In the middle 1990s, we were discussing the so-called harmonization of arms control commitment throughout the OSCE area in order to expand the commitments from the CFP treaty to neutral non-aligned countries in general. If you look at this list, you will immediately recognize, and this has been already mentioned by the Secretary General as well as by Ambassador, that things have changed over time. We are now in a situation when Russia and NATO are back to mutual deterrence postures, which is very different from the 1990s when we considered to be within the cooperative security mode of relations. The agenda of European security has changed very much, has transformed from addressing primarily intrastate conflicts, and that was the major European security issue in the 1990s, to the emergence of the new East-West security dilemma, in which we are nowadays in. We are in the situation of a decline of arms control on a large front. We'll see what is going to be out today from the Putin-Biden meeting, whether we get back on the track, at least on nuclear arms control. But generally, the CFP treaty is dysfunctional, although formally it still exists. The Open Skies Treaty is in the process of erosion with a few months left for Russia withdrawing after the US did withdraw. We have a lot of challenges in the nuclear arms control issues. And we do have, it's already mentioned, the emerging technologies, including new disruptive technologies, which make arms control generally very difficult. Against this change of the background, the question is, and I believe this is to some extent the question for today's chat, is the 1996 OSCE framework for arms control still relevant, or do we need to give ourselves another thought on the issue? Let me first of all emphasize one point which I believe is important. And this is not only about the OSCE framework for arms control, because you find this language in many other OSCE documents. There is an emphasis on the strong commitment by the participating states to pursue arms control. And this is part of the OSCE acquis. This is part of the OSCE commitments. Integral to the OSCE's comprehensive security concept. If you take this element out, you of course damage the general acquis of the OSCE, as well as of the concept of the comprehensive security, which is practiced by the OSCE. Secondly, if you go through the framework for arms control, it emphasizes the two tracks or the two arms of arms control. This is disarmament and confidence and security building. I will come back to this at the end, but this was also emphasized by the initial speakers. But the two arms are very important, especially against the backdrop of the current discussions within the OSCE. Madam Secretary General has already mentioned the principles which are enshrined in the framework. Those include sufficiency, transparency through information exchange, sufficiently intrusive verification, and limitation of forces. I'll give you a few more details on each of those principles. Sufficiency is discussed in the framework, but not only in this document, as the need for the participating states to maintain only such military capabilities which are commensurate with legitimate individual or collective security needs. Of course, it's a big question which has been discussed for decades within the OSCE. What does commensurate means? Who establishes this? And this is definitely up to the participating states in their discussion while pursuing arms control to figure out and to define what in any specific situation is or can be considered by all of them as commensurate or excessive capabilities. Transparency is provided primarily through the provision for complete, accurate, and timely exchange of relevant information. That should include the size, the structure, the location, and military doctrine of military forces, as well as the activities of the participating states. Verification is supposed to be commensurate with with the substance and significance of the arms control arrangements achieved by the participating states, and the verification in this respect being sufficiently intrusive, should be sufficiently intrusive to provide for the commensurate measures to verify the provided information exchanged by the states. So both is important, commensurate with the agreements on arms control and sufficiently intrusive. Limitation of forces, not only limitation, as the framework continues to specify limitations, and where necessary reductions of forces are an important element of the continuing search for security and stability. Other constraining provisions on armed forces and security building measures remain significant elements of the quest for stability. And to conclude, let me stop at my takeaway. Of course, the framework for arms control does not provide a specific blueprint on how we can proceed, but I believe that it does provide some guidance for us also in the contemporary circumstances to come back to the arms control agenda as anticipated by the framework of arms control. The first takeaway on my side will be that we need to understand and we need to realize that arms control is a commitment by the OSCE participating states. As such, it is part of the OSCE general acquis, as any other part of the acquis in whatever dimension you mean. Secondly, arms control is not about either or. It's not about either focusing on limitations or reductions or reducing yourself to confidence building. I think this is an important element of today's discussions within the OSCE. Following the guidance from the framework, we are supposed to pursue both at the same time. Arms control in the sense of limitations and reductions, as well as in terms of confidence building and transparency. Arms control arrangements are supposed to be supported by transparency and sufficiently intrusive verification, commensurate with the substance of arrangements. This is also part of the contemporary debate. What should come first? Should confidence building come first, or should arms control be pursued? And confidence building and transparency verification measures to be derived from the measures agreed in terms of limitations and reductions. The guidance we receive from the framework for arms control is we need to do both. And this emphasizes for me the relevance of the framework for arms control as a guiding document for pursuit of arms control within the OSCE area, because it is, despite of the change in the security landscape in Europe, it is exactly against the backdrop of return to the mutual deterrence, which makes the arms control negotiations and pursuit of arms control more relevant than before. Because arms control is specifically important to mitigate the risks which are inherent in eventual military confrontation, arms race, and with the danger of escalation of dangerous military incidents. Managing these risks is an important task for arms control. This makes the framework today probably more relevant than it was before, although we need to take into consideration the changing context of the European security landscape. Let me stop here, and we can come back to various issues at a later stage. Thank you.
Andrei, thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I believe the very last thing you said is particularly important, namely that arms control and CSBMs are no fair weather instrument, but rather that in times when deterrence thinking is more prominent, then arms control and CSBMs actually have an even larger role to play in managing relations between states. We have heard that there are political changes, of course, over the last 25 years. But of course, the question of change doesn't stop here. And the issue here is whether actually there's even more change in military technologies. And with this, I would like to introduce our second panelist today, who is Anya Lukyanova-Fink. Anya Fink is a research analyst with the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis. And her research focuses on Russian military thought, Russian approaches to deterrence, and technological innovation. as well as arms control and nuclear weapons issues. Prior to joining CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis, she was a fellow in the US Senate, focusing on national security and nuclear policy. Anya, I want to ask you, when we look at the framework for arms control, in particular its annex, which lists the different treaties and agreements, some of them have been already mentioned, the Open Skies Treaty, the Vienna document, but also at its center, the CEV Treaty. I think we realized that the weapon systems at its center, which are regulated, they mostly concern land-based systems. And my question would be whether you consider this approach still to be sufficient today in terms of risks of escalation and military stability. Should we continue to worry about tank divisions and artillery, or are there other military capabilities already in operation that we should focus on instead?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Alex. Secretary General, Ambassador, distinguished panelists and attendees, it's an honor to be here and join you today. Thank you so much to the organizers for their kind invitation. I have to start by saying that everything I say today is my personal opinion. My remarks will focus on how some of the capabilities that parties in the Euro-Atlantic already have today are challenging the region's interlocking and mutually reinforcing arms control architecture that we've already discussed today. These include long-range precision strike, hypersonic systems, air and missile defense, counter space and electronic warfare. These are far from emerging technologies. These are capabilities that are already under deployment and constitute essential parts of deterrence architectures and warfighting plans of states in the region. Before I discuss each set of capabilities in detail, let me make some broad remarks. Modern warfare is multi-domain, and it relies on a spectrum of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities. To date, the conventional arms control architecture has largely focused on land and air forces of the participant states across the 5 well-known categories we've discussed today, and has excluded naval forces. But warfare has evolved as capabilities and employment concepts have moved away from ground-based heavy armor and firepower central to Cold War warfare. As I will discuss shortly, today naval forces have long-range precise missiles to inflict extensive damage on ground targets from standoff ranges. The quality of weapons and the ability to derive synergistic effects from numerous systems at the same time has also become much more important than quantity. That is the feature of the current arms control architecture. Modern warfare is highly information intensive, meaning that it cannot be fought without reliable command control communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architectures that are located on the ground, at sea, in the air, and in space, and that provide constant awareness of the battle space. While firepower remains important to warfare as a whole, in the decisive early phases of a conflict, opponents can inflict significant damage and disorganization on one another's command and control infrastructure through electronic warfare, space, cyber and counter space capabilities. As has already been stated today, in the past, warfare was about seizing and holding territory. Modern warfare, however, is highly dynamic, and it relies on increased mobility, ability to quickly deploy flexible forces, and extensive military logistics to supply them. The current arms control architecture does not take these elements into account, and this limits its ability to provide transparency and predictability. But let me focus on key capabilities in greater detail. The first set of capabilities in question is long-range precision strike, based primarily in the air and at sea. We can think of these as conventional weapons with potential to provide strategic effects, or conventional weapons that can perform strategic tasks. The utility of these systems, stealthy precision strike cruise missiles, was first demonstrated during the Gulf War. And the last several decades have seen the proliferation of these capabilities across the globe. And as we've seen from military operations over the last decade, or 2 decades actually, naval forces play an instrumental role in warfare today because of this ability, the ability of sea-based, long-range, precision-guided missiles to damage targets on land. The current regime does not limit these in numbers, geography, and does not provide for information exchanges. Conventional precision strike capabilities have facilitated the development of operational concepts in some countries to attack civilian critical infrastructure, which can be highly escalatory. In addition, in modern military planning, There's also an interest in mixing conventional and nuclear strike capabilities, which may raise the prospect of a nuclear escalation of a conventional conflict. Both of these are highly dangerous trends. A subset of long-range precision strike are hypersonic systems that have burst onto the scene over the last several years. These are maneuvering weapons that can fly at speeds of at least Mach 5. Russia already has a limited nuclear hypersonic capability in its Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle, which may be accountable under the New START regime. Other hypersonic capabilities under development in Russia and China are potentially dual capable, used for conventional or nuclear operations. The United States is developing conventional hypersonic systems, and Russia is also potentially very interested in employing its hypersonic capabilities eventually as part of what it calls non-nuclear deterrence. So if hypersonic systems continue to develop at the current pace, they may be able to pose a significant threat to command and control architectures, including those involved in early warning and nuclear operations, and capable of conducting conventional counterforce operations at potentially intercontinental ranges. Hypersonic capabilities have no transparency measures. With the evolution of air power and precision strike, parties have continued to develop air and missile defense systems for aerospace defense tasks. If layered in a way that includes systems able to engage adversary systems of various ranges, these are able to engage a variety of targets ranging from aircraft, helicopters, precision munitions, cruise missiles, and unmanned systems. These are intended to defend critical infrastructure and command and control systems. For example, Russia has a lot of these systems intended to absorb the brunt of a potential US aerospace attack, something that it considers a potentially significant threat. One of the challenges, however, is that all of these systems can be highly mobile, and though defensive, they can also potentially be used as part of offensive operations. Some new aerospace defense capabilities are counterspace, meaning they have the ability to take out elements of command and control in space. We may think of these as highly futuristic weapons based on new physical principles, but some systems like directed energy and lasers are already being deployed today to perform aerospace defense tasks. The development of these new technologies or systems like railguns has not yet been taken into account at all, despite the fact that there are ongoing projects to develop such systems. As warfare continues to become more information intensive and networked, parties are able to derive greater benefits from disorganizing one another's command and control early in the conflict or in a so-called initial period of war. This thwarts an opponent's ability to communicate with forces or understand what's happening on the battlefield. Something like this is prized in modern warfare. The capabilities implicated here are electronic warfare, so systems that allow jamming and spoofing of electronic systems, cyber and counterspace systems that I've already discussed, all aimed potentially at achieving or denying information superiority. The challenge here is that these actions aimed at countering information networks may also affect civilian critical infrastructure and implicate nuclear operations. Or if, again, some of these end up attacking facilities implicated in performing nuclear operations, this can be potentially even more escalatory. And I would posit that this ability to disrupt through kinetic and non-kinetic means an opponent's command and control, and the ability of an opponent to have an awareness of the battle space early in the conflict may be much more important today than firepower or armor. In synergy with firepower, capabilities like these can potentially decisively affect the early phases of a conflict, which can be instrumental for how the conflict proceeds. This evolution in warfare has not yet been taken into account in the current arms control architecture. More broadly, conventional capabilities are becoming a part of states' broader deterrence architectures. There's an ongoing wave of military innovation as states' ability to engage in such innovation and develop and deploy these new technologies are also important to how states view themselves and their ability to deter, defend, and compete with others in the future. There have been ideas to update the conventional forces in Europe regime to include things like naval forces, long-range precision strike, hypersonic systems, air and missile defense, transport, some of these things that I discussed here today, and ideas to modernize the Vienna document to broaden the scope of information exchange related to some of these systems. And I think there's a lot of room for creativity and a significant need for dialogue to get us to a place where we're able to develop new measures for transparency and predictability of these systems. Thank you.
Anya, thank you very much for this tour de force through the different developments and the emergence of military technology over the last 3 decades, one has to say. What I take from your presentation is that we see a change from quantity to quality. We see an undermining of the firewall between conventional and nuclear capabilities. We also see an ever increasing connection between different domains of warfare that used to be separated in a way, or at least we dealt with that in a separate way, but now they're ever more connected. And from this derives one main risk, and that is a disruption of the systems that hold all these different domains together, which of course has to do with information technology. And on that, and I think on the issue of information superiority, which is probably key, and which military systems try to undermine in one sense, but also in another depend on these systems. One key aspect of that information superiority, of course, are cyber capabilities, as you mentioned, which are by nature very different from military capabilities we have been talking about so far, non-tangible, to some degree indivisible, and often secret. And on this, let me bring in Dr. Jörg Altmann to shed some more light on these issues. Mr. Altmann is a physicist and a peace researcher at the Technical University of Dortmund in Germany. And among others, his research focuses on the prospective assessment of military technologies and analysis of preventive arms control measures. He is also a co-founder of the German Research Association for Science, Disarmament, and International Security, FONAS, and of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. My question to Jürgen is, when we look into the cybersphere, how does this sphere differ from other strategic areas of warfare? Do you see ways how the existing principles that Andre mentioned at the beginning, which are part of the framework, sufficiency, transparency, verification, and last but not least, stability in the end, are these principles kind of adaptable to the cybersphere, like it is the case with the Vienna document for conventional forces?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this very important panel discussion. I agree with everybody who has spoken so far that new ideas and new creativity are needed to solve the problems that have already been described so aptly. But we need also some more political will on various sides of the spectrum. I'm not going into the political will thing, but I want to discuss the principles for arms control as Alexander has named them, and how they could be transferred to the realm of cyber warfare and the preparation of forces, of armed forces for cyber action. In principle, I'd say the good ideas that have been named in the framework for arms control, as well as in the preamble of the CFE treaty, for one, namely that the main goal of negotiations of arms control and of CSPMs should be to support and further stability. And stability exists if there is no primary motive for anybody to start a military conflict on the one hand, and more in particular in a crisis, if there is no impression that if I do not start shooting immediately, the enemy will, and I will lose significantly. So this creates this famous preemption doctrine of preemption idea or threat, and all activities of states with regard to limitation and of forces should have stability as their main priority. If we go to the cyber area, It has already been mentioned in short, but it can be observed that several dozen states by now have built up cyber forces that may act defensively in some circumstances, but they also prepare offensive action. And with several misunderstandings possible, and with civilian infrastructure also being used for military purposes, there is a big danger that cyber action, if it goes beyond a small sabotage here and there, as we have seen as well, that such cyber action can create big damage to civilian population and the civilian economy on the one hand, and also, and maybe that's the first priority, to the military infrastructures of the armed forces. And here we get into a special problem. That's if that in this case, it's not about flight times of missiles from 10 minutes to 35 minutes or so, but maybe it's reaction times over the internet that count by seconds or maybe even milliseconds. So there may be, or there must be, a high priority if an attack on oneself is being detected in cyberspace to react very fast, and maybe much faster than a human operator could react. This is somehow similar to what we have to expect if autonomous weapon systems would come into being, but I'm not talking about this at the moment. Nevertheless, there will be a pressure to automatize some highly relevant reactions in cyberspace. If it's all defensive, fine, but if it's counter-offensive, it creates the problem that maybe two such autonomous command and control systems channeled or organized, at least with the help of artificial intelligence or partly carried out by artificial intelligence, that two such systems will interact with each other in unforeseeable ways, and in particular in ways that could lead to escalation. So here is a big danger that has already been seen by states, and they have mentioned this, for instance, in the CBMs, the confidence building measures that the OSCE has agreed upon 2013 and 2016. And now I'd like to share my screen. Let's see whether this works. This should be here. So this is what I'm talking about now. Can there be confidence and security building measures for cyber forces? Who wants to know more can read this article. So let's have a look at the cyber CBMs without the S. As these, the military forces are included. So the cyber CBMs that have been agreed up to now, they do not include military forces. So if we look, for instance, at the recommendations of the UN group of governmental experts, there you find a number of states are developing ICT capabilities for military purposes. The use of ICTs in future conflicts between states is becoming more likely. States are rightfully concerned about the danger of destabilizing misperceptions, the potential for conflict, and the possibility of harm to their citizens, property, and economy. And the OSCE CBMs for the cybersphere say to enhance state cooperation, transparency, predictability, and stability, and to reduce the risks of misperception, escalation, and conflict that may stem from the use of ICT. So these two international organizations confirm the risks and dangers that I mentioned. However, on the one hand, they are voluntary and non-binding, and even though they refer to the threat by military preparations, they do not cover military forces. So there is a role model how CSBMs, namely confidence and security building measures for forces, can be organized for traditional forces. That's the Vienna document, most recent version 2011. It's a 60-page document which goes into very much detail what has to be exchanged at information. I'll show this example. So for instance, for a battle tank, the type has been given to the partners, the national nomenclature, the main gun caliber, the unladen weight, the night vision capability, etc., plus photographs presenting this vehicle from the right or left side, top and front views. So very much in detail, and the same holds for every rule that is about maneuver observation, etc. And what is important, these obligations are obligatory and they are politically binding, not legally, but nevertheless they are politically binding. So here you see the list of the chapters of the Vienna document, which starts with exchange of military information on the forces with organization and manpower. Then this exchange, as just mentioned, on major weapon or equipment systems, etc. Then exchange about policy and doctrines, risk reduction measures, contacts, prior notification of certain military activities above certain thresholds, etc. Several of you will have seen this, but it's good to make oneself again conscious of what all is in this important document. Now, the question that I posed to myself two or 3 years ago, and it is in detail in this article, can these confidence and security building measures be transferred to cyber forces? So if we go through the list, there are some that would be relatively easy to implement. So for instance, organization and manpower of cyber forces could be made, could be transferred information about this to partners. However, demonstration and information about the cyber weapons that one has prepared would be very intrusive and probably couldn't be accepted because the effectiveness of such cyber weapons stands or falls with the secrecy that is around them. Plans for deployment may be possible, but would be probably difficult to define and implement. This is deployment of forces and deployment in particular of weapons. Exchange of information on policy and doctrines is already in part in the CBM of the OSCE, Cyber CBMs number 7. So this could be taken as a starting point to extend it to military cyber forces. Risk reduction, same thing here. Several things are already recommended for these voluntary measures and needed to be extended to become obligatory in CSBMs for cyber forces. Other things such as contacts, visits to bases, military contacts, and so on, demonstration of new whatever cyber weapons would be very intrusive. Same holds for prior notification and so on. So there are a couple that would be very difficult to transfer, but there are also some that could be transferred relatively easily. So I am calling on the OSCE member states to think about the potential for starting CSBMs, confidence and security building measures for cyber forces. Thank you for your attention.
Jürgen, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, particularly the idea that one can actually develop a kind of Vienna document framework for cyber capabilities, at least in certain respects. And I think you also point to a very important conceptual problem or dilemma that is one between security and transparency as two dimensions and two issues of arms control. Let me bring in on this our last panelist for today. We have Maaike Verbruggen. Maaike is a doctoral researcher at the International Security Cluster at Vrije University at Brussels. And she specializes in emerging military technologies, military innovation and arms control. And in her PhD dissertations, she researches the enablers of and obstacles to military innovation in artificial intelligence. So who could be better equipped to talk to about truly emerging technologies that are not operational yet, but whose possible features and characteristics already today inspire both awe and fear, particularly in terms of a loss or possible loss of human control over decision-making when it comes to questions of life and death. Maaike, we have heard from Jürgen that in the cyber realm, there is this particular challenge when it comes to transparency and verification, because the high level of necessary intrusion, as I said, often undermines the ability to uphold military secrecy, or even reduces potential military use of cyber weapons, cyber capabilities. When we are talking more specifically about AI in weapon systems and automation as it is developing now, do we see similar challenges? Which concerns actually do exist with artificial intelligence? And how can we possibly address them and manage them with the help of arms control and CSPMs?
Well, I don't promise I have the full answer here, but I'll give a rough sketch of the next 20 years based on the current state of research and development, both in the scientific and in the military realms. So I won't really discuss specific weapons, but I'm more on general types of changes that we see in the conventional realm, which focusing here on the networking between weapons, the emergence, and the shifting away from expensive platforms. So because the entire point of AI is it's not a standalone technology, but it's an enabling or general purpose technology that you integrate into weapon systems. So it can do a whole range of things. So therefore, I won't talk about specific weapons, but more about what AI will do to weapons and what that means for arms control, what we currently have. So my first point here is that the networkingization, or however to call it, will make it less meaningful to focus on specific individual weapons like current arms control regimes are structured. So we are already seeing a lot of increasing developing of networks between weapons. And AI both helps connect between these systems, and also that AI gathers and processes data and then shares with other systems. So you can create these systems configurations, which we've seen in the past as well. But this will only get stronger and stronger. And it also means that the value more and more then comes from the network instead of the individual properties of the weapons that are part of it. It makes it harder to meaningfully differentiate and consider what are the key weapon systems of concern. So most of our discussions are always on arms systems, obviously. But if we have drones that capture data and then process it and then share it with arms systems, this specific distinction becomes less meaningful and doesn't fit well in our current structures of regulation, which are much more focused on individual systems with strict boundaries, while the network configurations means that, the value for militaries is in the whole instead of these individual systems. So alternative approaches here is that we can consider more the systems of systems perspective for arms control, and looking at these weapons within their configurations, or looking at specific uses of impacts of weapons, which is what the discussion on autonomous weapons is about. But this whole, the changes brought upon by AI are much larger than autonomous weapons. So it's good to have these discussions in a broad perspective, and think about what it means for the human-machine relation, so to say. Like the second, like building upon that, like beyond networking, you've got emergence, which is what swarms have to offer. So it means similar to what you see in schools of fish or flocks of birds. Flocks. It means that even though the individual units might be relatively simple, but the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So by working together, interacting amongst each other, and coordinating to reach a common objective, you can have much more power as a whole that cannot be reduced to what all the individual units have to offer. So consider then swarms of drones, like they might be individually rather simple, but by working together, interacting, and then jointly achieving the goals set for them, there's much more value to the system as a whole. But it also means that it's harder to think how to regulate such a system. And especially the problem here is with, the risk of the dangers of miscalculation and misunderstanding, which are at the fundamentals of our discussions here in the OSCE. Because the problem is that because we have these capabilities as a swarm at the whole level, the network level, but it cannot necessarily be completely controlled through the programming and in the individual level simultaneously. So these swarms are generally not necessarily developed through very formal models setting exactly out how the system is supposed to work, but it's much more iterative, like try a million different configurations until you find something that works. And it means that you can't validate and verify. So I'm not talking about verification in the arms control sense, but the techniques to ensure that your weapon will work as it should, that it will be safe and that it will be reliable. That you can't validate and verify them at both the level of individual units and the network, the swarm as a whole, which makes them inherently unpredictable. And it also makes it very hard for operators to be fully aware of the state of the swarm. What is it doing to give commands at the exact right moment and remain in full control. And this is not just a risk for you as the operator, but for everyone if these swarms, if even the swarms interact or engage in an unintended manner. So another potential option that we could consider here to deal with the challenges from swarms is to also consider we don't currently have these techniques to figure out how we can ensure that swarms are validated and verified and safe and reliable. But there are potential opportunities here in fundamental exploration into what we could do together to. Sorry, I'm getting lost there, but I think there are real opportunities here potentially to explore what we could do jointly in these problems with verification and validation, because these are joint problems and in no one's interest if these systems are unpredictable and out of our control. So, but AI doesn't also change how weapons are used in the field, but also how they are developed. Because you think of current weapons, these are generally expensive, high quality platforms that take decades to develop, very expensive. So often countries only have a few of them beyond the great powers. But AI is developed in a completely different way. So for instance, as you all probably know, that the software develops much quicker than traditional military technology. And it's not just quicker, but it's also constantly changing. But also from a cost perspective, like the costs are much more in developing software, where for hardware, it's very much also about the production, which costs a ton. So it also means that getting a lot of systems will be much cheaper. As now, like there's the quantity has a quality on its own, so to say. If we can see what AI has to offer for smaller systems, then you're not stuck with the cost of all these individual productions of the prediction of these individual units, which is the issue with swarms, and that's why militaries are interested in them, because if you lose one, it's not the end of the world, because the value is in the collective. And of course, then the question is, how do you regulate something abstract like that? And how do you regulate technology that changes much quicker and that incorporates much more commercial off-the-shelf technology, or that other sort of approaches with much more prototyping in the field, for instance, with 3D printing and seeing from a much more bottom-up perspective, how can soldiers innovate with AI and new technology? How can they do more programming? Which is, there's clear benefit for militaries here, but it also means that there's much less testing of these systems. We're much It's a question to what extent, well, legal or Article 36 reviews are actually conducted for each adaptation, especially if we're talking about rapid prototyping. I mean, civilian technology, it's already like questionable to what extent they are tested from with the standards that military uphold. And yeah, the problems I mentioned with the lack of techniques for validation and verification, that's just a problem for AI at large. So another option we could also explore is thinking about, similar to the document on ammunition stockpiles, like what are the opportunities to consider best practices or guidance for testing here, both to ensure that weapons will not interact or won't engage unintendedly, and this therefore also might help building confidence, like in a time we can really use it. I mean, I'm obviously, I know that the climate is tough and that some ideas are a long shot, but I think that we've all heard a million times how hard arms control is these days. And I do agree, but I think it's also important sometimes to just bounce around ideas here with each other in this discussion and look for opportunities instead of all the ways in which it will never work out anyway.
Micah, this was just wonderful, particularly your very last sentence. I think that is a very good last sentence to end at least our presentations on, that we want to throw out ideas, want to be creative. Now I think it's time that we move to the Q&A. There are already many questions from our audience. And I would like to start with the question that is right now also the most popular one, by William Hill. And I think it addresses all issues that have been mentioned by all four of our experts. Because Mr. Hill wants to know, since there are so many challenges, technological challenges that have been mentioned here in different areas by different systems and technologies, to the framework, to the treaties and agreements right now that do exist, such as the CFE that is, of course, not yet ratified and in force, but the Vienna document. And the question is it possible to update these documents? Do you consider it possible to update them so that they reflect the new capabilities and threats you have been talking about? Or would it be better to embark on an entirely new negotiations to reach separate and new agreements for some of the technologies you have been mentioning? I would just give this to all four panelists. And I would start with Andrei Zagorski, since he has been the first presenter. Andrei, are you with us?
I think he's frozen for now. Maybe another expert first.
Okay, then we will just move on and wait for Andrei to come back. Anja, may I ask you, you have been mentioning also naval forces and other capabilities that are not part of the treaties right now. Do you think that one of these capabilities can be somehow attached to the existing treaties, or do we need something totally different?
Thank you so much for that question. I was actually very curious to hear what Dr. Zagorski was going to answer, because I think he is going to be able to answer the sort of the diplomatic dimension of this much better than me. I will just say that I think we have a legacy of cooperative security in the Euro-Atlantic, and scrapping it all together is something that will be just a waste, right? So I think to my mind, it's important to build on the legacy and the history that we have, and kind of try to square the politics with the existing challenges of the emergence of these capabilities.
All right, thank you very much. Jürgen, what is your take on this issue? You have already mentioned it to some extent in the presentation.
Well, in general, I would just agree to Anya. Do not throw away what exists there. Much of this still is functioning well. Some are a little bit problematic, but nevertheless, it's there. And throwing it away and starting from scratch would be, I think, a big mistake. In more concrete terms, I have understood that the CVMs that the OSCE has are completely focusing on civilian issues, also from exchanges that I had with the respective department, the cyber department in the OSCE. So the Forum for Security Cooperation, that is the arm of the OSCE that deals with military issues, should take up the idea and getting ideas on how cyber forces could be put into it. So what the actual legal formulation then would be an addendum to the Vienna document or a new Vienna document with another chapter on cyber forces would have to be discussed, of course, and it's up to the state. I don't make too many recommendations there, but I think with enough goodwill, the solution, at least for the simple things that I mentioned, should be possible for the cyber forces.
Okay, thank you. Maggie, you have also already mentioned some ideas how to move on AI in particular, in terms of arms control, risk reduction, transparency. But also to you the question by William Hill. Do you think if there's any treaty right now, any agreement to which AI could somehow be, adapted, included, attached to?
I totally agree with the other panelists. First of all, by build upon what you have. I mean, not just because it's things are not going amazing, but also it's building upon an already existing framework, and shared understanding will only enhance. And I mean, we have this umbrella framework within the OSCE specifically to add new sub-elements that we might think become relevant later on. So it doesn't necessarily require an entire new treaty. The question is just specifically for AI, that a very specific weapon-oriented treaty might not be the best, but there's a lot to AI, and so much relevant for confidence building measures and all the other frameworks that already exist, that I don't see how AI is in any way like fundamentally contradictory with the majority of frameworks.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, there's one specific aspect of military AI uses that goes into the form of specific weapons, even though that's a fairly general class. That's autonomous weapon systems. And as many people will know, there are discussions underway in the CCW Convention in Geneva whether such systems should be prohibited or at least somehow limited. And I think in the European context, it would be a good idea to go forward and prohibit autonomous shooting. So here we have not the general problem of looking at what type of AI is being used in what military unit or at what military level of command and communication and control. How it's kind of still fitting into the old treaty, such as, for instance, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether Andrzej Zagorski is back with us.
I think we have lost him for now. I hope he will log again.
Okay. All right. If not yet, then I would take another question. And I think there is a question here by Philip Terence Hauptmann. And he asked whether the nature of emerging technologies and cyber capabilities insofar as it is related to global questions and is not limited to the OSCE area, whether this is actually a problem. So he asks whether, in other words, to what extent can these issues be usefully addressed only within the OSCE framework, and what issues can only be addressed effectively at the larger global level. And maybe, Anya, I would like to ask you, first of all, with technologies that are already here that are in operation, like precision strike weapons, what is your take on that question?
Well, so the broader challenge here is political, right? How do you actually get to a discussion of some of these technologies, and what forum do you use, right? Because if we were just discussing the functional elements of the weapons, I think a lot of these conversations would be much easier. You know, we would agree what elements of them are destabilizing and how and to whom, and just kind of work through the sort of the issues. I think the question about whether it should be broader than the OSCE is an interesting one, because it's clear that you know, for example, you know, the United States and Russia have long-range precision strike capabilities, clearly, and so the question is, what do you do about these systems, and kind of how do you limit them, and is it even possible to limit them in an OSCE context, or do you have to take them in a bilateral context separately? And so I would say that I think there's probably room for creativity in forums and creativity in ways to approach these issues. But I would say that the OSCE has been sort of the pioneering forum for discussing these things. And even if it doesn't end up being the forum for doing these things, it should definitely lead the way in terms of dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Andrzej Zagorski is back. Hello, great to have you here again.
I had to rejoin the meeting.
Because I wanted to ask you a particular question that came up from the audience by Dumitru Mințarari, and he asked that he would like to ask the opinion of all the presenters on the claim that states should not strengthen their security on the expense of others. And he says here have been arguments that while the statement may look politically uncontroversial, it is technically misleading and vulnerable to interpretations. Allowing one to claim anything may trigger one's insecurity, and exploiting the claim to block anything, both justifiably and unjustifiably. So I think the essence of the question goes to another principle that is very prominent in the document, which is the indivisibility of security in Europe. And of course, this, I think, was one of the main statements and also goals for the OSCE in the 1990s. And my question to you, Andre, would be, what is your view on this principle? Can we still speak of it? Are there different interpretations, and to what extent actually is it still a useful framework for our discussions when it comes to arms control in the OSCE area?
Thank you, and sorry again for disappearing. Let me start by saying that, of course, not every single issue can be fixed within the OSCE and by the OSCE. What is important, however, in the OSCE acquis is a commitment to pursue arms control, but this can be pursued in very different frameworks. I saw a question coming from Bill Hill with respect to conventional armed forces. This was something which was done primarily by NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries initially, and which was reduced to the 30 countries which were parties to the CFE. So not everything would be addressed within the OSCE format, but the OSCE, of course, can play a role in promoting things. Coming back to the question, I think this is important because I believe this is one of the major elements for what we need to talk about within the OSCE. On the one hand, we have the principle of the freedom of alliances. On the other hand, we have the commitment, which is in the framework for arms control, as well as in the code of conduct, that while exercising the freedom of alliances, states need to take into considerations legitimate security interests of the others, no matter whether those states are members of alliances or not. And this is an area in which we have a lot of ambiguities, because one of the approaches to this question is the concept of commensurate forces. What are commensurate forces? Because something which one country may see as excessive forces could be seen as very much commensurate forces for the other one. Another part of the acquis is a requirement for the multilateral defense organizations to remain within the, if you wish, political legal space of the OSCE, to observe the norms of the OSCE. And this is also often questionable and subject of discussions. This can be addressed only through a genuine dialogue, seeking to specify issues to the extent possible, although we cannot specify it for all the times. I must say that we did have such kind of dialogue in the 1990s. And one example is the discussion on the adaptation of the CFE Treaty, which was part of the Russia-NATO discussions in the context of the beginning NATO enlargement. And that was very much part, pointing to deficiencies of the old CFE. It was very successful, but it was no longer up to date in the context of NATO enlargement. So we needed to adapt it, we did it. And we engaged very much in the productive dialogue. We forgot this culture in the 2000s. And this is the bad thing. Can we do it necessarily through the OSCE? Yes, we can. But of course, many issues will be delegated to other forums. This is simply the commitment to talk to each other and to respect the legitimate security interests of other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Going back from the OSCE, let me insert one question here that's related to the OSCE before we go back to technology as such, because there's a question by Anton Eicher, who asks what kind of role the Forum for Security Cooperation will play in discussing new arms control measures, since its mandate contains negotiation of arms control in CSPMs. I think that's a perfect question for you, Andrei.
Well, the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation is the central body within the OSCE which concentrates its discussions on military political issues of European security. In the past, the forum has generated a number of fairly important sets of commitments by the OSCE states, and almost all of those documents fall in the 1990s. A few of them were added later on, but such documents like the global exchange of information or measures of stabilization in the conflict areas, and several others, including the guidance for arms transfers, etc. These are the products of the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation. Once we come back to the dialogue on those issues, the OSCE Forum may produce more documents which would reflect the consensus among the participating states, providing guidance and adding to the commitments in the specific areas like light weapons, etc.
Thank you. As I said, coming back now from the OSCE related topic as such to the question of technology and regulation, more generally speaking, and I would like to address the question to Maike. So there's a question from Luc Meurman, and he says, Mardik's law states that technology changes at the exponential rate, and organizations only change at the logarithmic rate, so slower. And the question he has is, doesn't this mean that we will perpetually be trying to catch up, but never will be able to really keep up this pace of regulation with the pace of the development of technologies and the full spectrum of threats that are associated with it? So I think my question is to you, Mike, when we consider autonomous weapons, when we consider AI, do you see this risk that it's actually not possible to regulate because technological change is happening so fast?
I don't think that's necessary at all per se, but you have to be smart in how you set it up. So what you want is to figure out, for instance, how you want the human-machine relations to be, what sort of role you think the human operator must have, and or another essential question is the issue of testing that I touched upon as well. Like figure out how we can develop good best practices from how to test AI, and these are fundamental to the problem of AI at large. And if the specific like algorithms keep on changing, that does not change these fundamental problems that we have. Like in international law, we have the Geneva Conventions, which are not specific to technologies, but about how to conduct war. So if we think about how can we make more timeless sort of regulation that is less bound by the specifics of the weapons that we have, but about which functions that we want to regulate, or the human-machine relation, that I think is really critical here. And then combined with flexibility in our response. And I 100% agree with your last point on the importance of dialogue here, especially when times are tough, because that's why you need arms control. So especially when it's tough and technology is developing quickly like now, that means that then it's critical important to even if it is difficult to come to legal treaty, to develop at least a joint understanding about, well, what is not desirable, like what are the boundaries that we find acceptable.
Thank you very much. Let me add one question of my own, and I will address it to Jurgen. I think it's connected to what you just said, namely the let's say existing framework and the challenge of the new technologies that are different in terms of the cyber sphere and cyber capabilities. Because you have presented this idea of applying ideas from the Vienna document to the cyber sphere. And the usual history is that we start with CSBMs and then we move into the direction of regulations, even disarmament, but most generally speaking, arms control proper. And that is also something that Andre mentioned in his presentation, that is one part, of course, of arms control, CSBM and reductions. My question would be whether you see a possibility that we could actually end up, when we talk about cyber capabilities, in an area of arms control proper, arms control in terms of reductions, or is this idea of a stable balance of forces not applicable to the cyber world simply because the features of the cyber capabilities are so different?
Okay, good question. I didn't mention it in my first presentation, but I think what is dearly needed is limitations of cyber forces. And it's a kind of an emergency procedure in view of the difficulty of having arms control for cyber forces to go to CSBMs as a first step. But the traditional procedure was, if there is too much mistrust and no working mechanisms for verification and limitation and definition and so on can be found, then at least let us do some transparency measures. And this was the invention of CSBMs. So I see them as a first step that could optimally lead in the end, or wait, not so far away, to actual limitations and maybe prohibitions. Problem is, as you already said, of course, you can present a tank, and a tank is not really easily reproduced. However, a computer bug, is malware, piece of malware can be copied arbitrarily at practically no cost. So counting cyber weapons is, in this sense, not possible. However, there could be some limits on the personnel working there. And there's some ideas that colleagues of mine here in Germany have discussed, that if one could have limits on the, let's say, the bandwidth capability of certain cables or certain connections, satellite connections that go to cyber forces buildings and so on. But this is at the moment all is still very vague. What we would need is computer science-based hard research. What could be done on the one hand for having limits that would somehow still allow some military capabilities, but cut off the most dangerous offensive uses. And on the other hand, how could one verify the compliance with such limitations? And we have some ideas, we have seen some ideas, but it's much too little. And maybe the OSCE could also ask researchers and maybe fund some projects. What could be done in this area?
Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer. I will take one last question, and I will take the question by Anton Eiche again, who asked how to manage and realize the step from discussing risks and threats in the structured dialogue, I suppose SD stands for, which lasts already for 5 years, to a negotiation process in the appropriate format. So coming from our discussions about concepts to the question of how to actually implement that. And Ambassador Cuesta wanted to answer this question, so I will pass on to you.
Thank you, Alexander. Since it's a very internal OSCE issue, I thought that it was appropriate for me to jump in. First thing, I mean, participating states would need to agree on the need to negotiate something new. It's not clear, at least now, that there is this appetite to negotiate something new. What we are trying to do in the structured dialogue is try to understand what risks and challenges to security do participating states perceive, and then decide what to do with it, then decide the way forward. Try to decide whether the instruments and the toolbox that the OSCE has now is enough to address those challenges and risks, or we need something else, be it further developing the current agreements or instruments, or negotiating something new, negotiating a new architecture. So it's in the structured dialogue, I would say we have taken a step-by-step approach. We try to address specific problems with concrete measures, with concrete answers. And in doing so, we try to build a minimum of trust, a minimum of confidence that might be useful and might be necessary in order to address more complex issues when the time is right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Cuesta. With that, I would like to sum up our discussion for today. I think we have covered very different topics. We have talked about the origins and the logic of the OSCE arms control framework. We have talked about the challenges posed by already operational weapon systems. We have heard a proposal of how we can actually approach CBMs in cyberspace. And finally, we have been discussing the question of autonomous weapons, AI, and also the specific challenges they pose to humanitarian international law and the role of humanitarian arms control when it comes to these systems. I just want to say thank you to all four panelists for their great insights. And also, once again, want to thank OSCE Secretary General Schmidt and Ambassador Cuesta for being with us today. I hope our discussion provided you, the audience, with some food for thought that will enable us all to reverse a negative development concerning conventional arms control and CSPM in Europe. Thank you very much for watching and have a good evening. Goodbye.